My family mocked me for buying junk until it made me rich and I did this. You ever have one of those moments where people laugh at you, tell you you're wasting your time, then suddenly those same people are blowing up your phone, acting like they've been cheering you on the whole time? Yeah, that happened to me. For years, my family treated me like I was nothing. A screw-up, a waste of potential, the guy who just couldn't get his act together. My brother, Lucas? He was the golden child. Big corporate job in the city, a car that practically drove itself, a house that looked like something out of a magazine. Me? I had grease under my nails and a garage that barely kept the lights on. They looked at me like I was some kind of failure. But then one day I bought a rusted-out hunk of junk for $200 from an old farmer. And that was the beginning of everything. It started like any other day. I woke up to the sound of my trailer's heater rattling against the cold, one of its two settings, Arctic tundra or the surface of the sun. Grabbed a gas station coffee and a Pop-Tart I found in my truck's glove compartment. 5-star dining. Stepped outside and took in the usual sights, my leaning garage, a busted tire propped against the fence, my neighbor Gary standing on his porch in a bathrobe sipping something that wasn't just coffee. You still running that high-end auto business of yours? Gary smirked, nodding toward my garage. The business was just a shed with a half-broken neon sign that flickered Crow Auto when it felt like working. Living the dream, I muttered, taking another sip of coffee. Gary chuckled. Saw Lucas on TV last night. It's a business panel or something. Guy's got a nice suit. I didn't respond. Because, of course, my family would brag about Lucas being some big shot in the city. But me? I was just an afterthought. The morning dragged. Fixed up a beat-up '94 Ford, just enough to knock a little off my overdue electric bill. The highlight of my day? An old lady came in for an oil change and tipped me with a homemade pie, honestly, best payment I got all week. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, figuring it was another scam call. But something made me pick up. Eddie? That you? The voice was old. Familiar. Yeah. Who's this? Joe. Joe Garrison. My chest tightened. Joe was an old-school farmer, the kind of guy who believed duct tape and determination could fix anything. I used to help out on his farm when I was a kid, back when I thought I'd be something. I need a favor, Joe continued. Got an old heap of metal sitting in my barn. Been collecting dust for decades. Figured you might want it before I haul it to the scrapyard. I frowned. What kind of heap? Joe chuckled. Come see for yourself. I glanced around my garage. Half-fixed cars. Overdue invoices. The same dead-end routine I'd been stuck in for years. Maybe, just maybe, this was worth checking out. The drive to Joe's farm was exactly as I remembered it. Long stretches of empty road, the occasional faded billboard advertising a diner that probably hadn't served a decent burger since the '90s. By the time I pulled up, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the sagging barn. Joe was waiting outside, leaning against the doorframe, overalls stained with grease, a cigarette barely hanging onto his lip. He nodded toward the barn. In there. Inside, dust and motor oil filled the air. Sunlight streamed through cracks in the walls, cutting through piles of rusted tools, forgotten projects, and then I saw it. Tucked against the back wall, covered in decades of grime, was the unmistakable outline of a fastback Mustang. My heartbeat kicked up a notch. I ran a hand over the dust-covered hood, brushing off years of neglect. Beneath the grime, hints of blue paint peeked through. The windshield was intact. The body wasn't perfect, but it wasn't beyond saving either. I crouched near the front bumper, wiping away another thick layer of dust until I found what I was looking for. The VIN plate. Pulling out my phone, I typed it in, my fingers shaking slightly. A quick search confirmed it. This wasn't just some old Mustang. This was a 1967 Shelby GT 500. A car worth more than everything I owned combined. Joe watched me with mild amusement. So, you interested? I forced myself to stay calm. What are you looking to get for it? He scratched his chin, taking a slow drag from his cigarette. Was gonna haul it off to the scrapyard next week. They offered me $200 for the weight. You want it, it's yours for the same. I nearly choked. $200. For a car that, even in this condition, was worth more than my entire garage? I did some quick math in my head. Even if I sold half my tools, skipped rent, and lived off instant noodles for a month, I'd still be coming out ahead. I kept my face neutral. That seems fair. Joe nodded like we were sealing a deal over a couple of beers. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a wad of crumpled 20s, and handed it over. He pocketed the cash without a second thought, no idea he had just let go of something worth more than his entire barn. You need help loading it up? Joe asked, barely glancing back at the car. I shook my head. I got it. We rolled it out into the sunlight, and for the first time I got a full look at it. Faded paint. Rust spots. Atheo had seen better days. To everyone else it was a pile of junk. To me, it was my way out. But as soon as I unhooked the tow straps in my driveway, I heard it. Laughter. First, a chuckle. Then, full-on wheezing. I didn't even have to turn around to know who it was. Gary, my ever-observant neighbor, was already leaning against his truck, nursing a beer. "You serious, Crow?" he hollered. "That thing got a gas tank or a beehive in the trunk?" I clenched my jaw, focusing on the car. The way I saw it? Their opinions weren't paying my bills. When you spend years stuck in one place, you start to accept certain truths about yourself. For me, one of those truths was that people like Gary and my own family saw me as nothing more than a joke. But staring at that rusted heap in my driveway, I saw something they never could: potential. I didn't waste a single moment. As soon as the sun rose the next morning, I was outside with tools scattered across the driveway, tearing into the car like a surgeon performing emergency surgery. Removing decades of neglect wasn't easy. Rusty bolts, stripped screws, and stubborn parts tested every ounce of patience I had. Sweat dripped down my forehead, my knuckles bled, and my neighbors shook their heads every time they walked by. To them, I was just throwing away my time on a worthless hunk of metal. But the more they doubted, the more determined I got. A few days into working on the car, I realized something strange. The rust wasn't as bad as I thought. Sure, it needed new panels, fresh paint, and a mountain of engine work, but it was salvageable. More than salvageable. Then I found something that changed everything. Hidden under a pile of rotted seat cushions in the trunk was a small leather bag. At first glance, it looked like trash, something left behind when the car was abandoned decades ago. But as I picked it up, the unmistakable sound of metal clinking together sent a chill down my spine. Inside was a collection of old, heavy coins, gold coins. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My heart started pounding as I dumped them onto my workbench. They glittered under the dim garage lights, stamped with dates from the early 1900s. A quick online search sent my heart racing even faster. Each of those coins was worth thousands. Combined, they could easily be worth tens of thousands, maybe more. My hands shook as I stared at the small fortune in front of me. I thought about calling someone, telling someone what I'd found. But who could I trust? Not my family. Not Gary. No, I decided right there this was my secret. And it was exactly what I needed to turn my life around. But then, just when I thought everything was finally going my way, I heard a car door slam. As I looked up, my heart sank. Standing at the end of the driveway with his arms crossed and that smug grin on his face was my brother Lucas. Of course. The golden boy had picked today, of all days, to stop by. "Seriously, Elliot?" he asked, eyeing the car with open disgust. "Are you still wasting your time on junk?" I quickly shoved the coins into my pocket and forced a smile. "What brings you to my neighborhood?" Lucas sighed dramatically. "Mom sent me. She's worried about you and thinks you're struggling." "Can't imagine why." I laughed bitterly. "Tell Mom I'm doing just fine." He glanced around skeptically. "Clearly." I bit my tongue. Lucas had no idea what I was sitting on. He had spent his whole life assuming he was better than me, richer, smarter, more successful. And I was finally holding something that could shatter his smug attitude once and for all. Instead of snapping back, I just shrugged and turned away, getting back to work on the car. Lucas shook his head, muttered something about me needing to grow up, and drove off without another word. The moment he left, I rushed inside, locked the door, and carefully laid the coins out on my kitchen table. My mind was racing. Who could I take them to without getting scammed? Were they even real gold? How much were they worth? I spent the entire night researching. Forums, coin collectors, auction sites. I combed through every resource I could find. And what I discovered nearly knocked me out of my chair. The coins were real, antique, and incredibly valuable. A single coin from this collection had recently sold at auction for over $10,000. And I had a whole bag of them. By morning, I realized that the rusted old car wasn't just a chance to prove everyone wrong, it was my ticket to a new life. But if I was going to do this right, I had to be careful. One wrong move and I could lose it all. And that's exactly when my phone buzzed again. A message from Lucas. "By the way, Mom and Dad are having a family dinner this Saturday. It'd be good if you showed up this time." He had no idea how ironic his message was. Because I was going to show up, and when I did, they'd never see it coming. I spent the days leading up to that family dinner with only one goal in mind: preparation. Not just fixing up the Shelby or getting those gold coins appraised, though I did both, but preparing myself mentally for what was going to be one of the most satisfying nights of my life. I hadn't been to a family dinner in almost 2 years, and the last time I'd shown up, my parents had spent the evening grilling me about my life choices. Nick had bragged endlessly about his latest promotion, and Lauren mocked my little auto hobby. Not this time. This time, things would be different. On the morning of the dinner, I stood in front of the mirror, tugging nervously at my brand new button-down shirt, one I'd splurged on, partly as a confidence boost, partly just to see the look on their faces when I walked in. For the first time in a long time, I felt ready. Pulling up to my parents' house later that evening, I couldn't help but feel a little rush of adrenaline. My parents' home was straight out of a suburban catalog, a manicured lawn, perfectly trimmed hedges, the whole cliché. A stark contrast from my garage, where half the lights flickered and the coffee machine only worked if you slapped it twice. Nick's shiny new BMW sat parked out front, of course. Lauren's spotless SUV was parked neatly behind it. I parked my rusty truck on the curb, took a deep breath, and stepped out, bracing myself for the inevitable. The front door opened before I even knocked. My mom stood there, already eyeing my outfit skeptically. "Look who decided to show up," she said flatly, ushering me inside like she expected I'd ruin the expensive rug just by standing on it. Inside, nothing had changed. The house was pristine, obsessively clean, and every surface shined like a show home. My dad sat at the head of the table, giving me his typical once-over. Lauren and Nick were already there, sitting comfortably, looking like magazine cutouts from a perfect family photo shoot. And then, as if rehearsed, the criticism began. "You could have at least shaved," my dad grumbled. "Still driving that rusty bucket?" Lauren asked, smiling just a little too sweetly. "How's the garage thing going?" Nick chimed in, smirking. "Still living the dream?" They laughed. They always laughed. Usually, I would just sit there, take it quietly, eat quickly, and leave feeling worse than when I arrived. But tonight was different. Tonight, I had a secret weapon. I waited for a lull in the conversation, calmly took a sip of water, and finally spoke. "You know, things have been pretty amazing lately," I started, keeping my voice casual. I stumbled onto something interesting in my garage. A classic car. Worth a bit more than I expected. Nick chuckled. "Oh, what, did you finally manage to sell one of those junk heaps for scrap?" I smiled softly. "Not exactly. I found an old Shelby Mustang and got it dirt cheap. Turns out it's a rare 67 GT 500. Even better, I discovered a stash of antique gold coins hidden in the trunk." There was immediate silence. My dad's fork froze midair. Lauren nearly choked on her salad. Nick stared at me, eyes narrowed, trying to figure out if I was joking. "What?" my mom finally managed, her voice thin and uncertain. "Yeah," I continued, calm as ever. "Already had an appraiser look at them. They're worth quite a bit. Like, a life-changing amount." No one said anything for a long moment. Then Lauren laughed, forced and nervous. "Come on. There's no way." I shrugged. "Believe whatever you want. But let's just say my days of worrying about rent are pretty much over." Nick finally spoke, skepticism dripping from his voice. "Prove it." I leaned back and smiled. "I don't have to prove anything. You'll see soon enough." No one knew how to respond. For the first time, my family was at a loss for words. I let the silence stretch, relishing every uncomfortable second. Eventually, my dad cleared his throat awkwardly and tried to steer the conversation back to safer territory. But the damage was already done. They couldn't stop glancing my way, silently assessing me, recalibrating their opinions. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the family punchline. And honestly, it felt incredible. After dinner, as I walked toward my truck, Nick caught up to me. He looked unsure, hesitant, something I'd never seen from him before. "Elliot," he began quietly. "You serious about all this?" I turned slowly, meeting his eyes. "Dead serious." He stared at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. "Wow," he muttered, shaking his head slowly. "Good for you, man." I nodded once, climbed into my truck, and drove off without another word. As I watched their house shrink in my rearview mirror, I felt lighter than I had in years. But what I didn't realize yet, my newfound success was about to trigger a chain reaction of events I could never have anticipated. After leaving my parents' house that night, something shifted in my life. For the first time, I had respect, not just from random customers or friends, but from the family that had always seen me as the screw-up. Word about the Mustang and the hidden gold quickly got around. Within days, my phone was buzzing nonstop, not just from curious relatives but even old classmates I hadn't spoken to in years. Suddenly, the guy everyone ignored became someone worth noticing. I enjoyed the newfound attention, I won't lie. My shop started filling up faster. People came by just to chat, to see the car that changed everything, or to casually ask about the gold. But I knew better than to spill all my secrets. One afternoon, while sorting through tools in the garage, a sleek black SUV rolled up, blocking my driveway. At first, I figured it was another curious visitor. But when the driver stepped out, my stomach dropped. It was Lucas, dressed sharp as always, but looking oddly uncomfortable this time. "What's up?" I asked cautiously. He offered an awkward smile, shifting from foot to foot like he had bad news. "Hey, Elliot. Can we talk for a minute?" I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Something wrong?" He cleared his throat, struggling to meet my gaze. "Mom and Dad? Well, they're dealing with some stuff. Dad's job situation got worse and the house payments, they're underwater, man." I paused, tools still in my hand, waiting for him to continue. "I was thinking," Lucas finally said, "maybe you could help them out? You know, with the gold you found." I almost laughed. Almost. Here it was again. The classic move, treating me like family only when they needed me. But this time was different. Lucas wasn't smug or condescending, he looked desperate. Which meant things must have been genuinely bad. And why exactly is this my responsibility? I asked, leaning against my toolbox. Lucas sighed deeply. Look, I know how they've treated you. I get it, man. But they're family. Isn't that what we do? His words lingered in the air. Family. It was funny how conveniently that word was thrown around. It had never applied to me when things were good, only when they were in trouble. I haven't heard from them directly, I finally said. Why send you? Lucas glanced away, his voice softer now. They thought you'd shut them out. They figured I might have better luck. I almost laughed. Even now, they still don't dare to face me themselves. Sorry, Lucas. I worked hard for everything I have, I said firmly. They spent years ignoring me. It's not my job to bail them out now. Lucas nodded slowly, understanding dawning on his face. Yeah, I figured you'd say that. He left quietly, no arguments, no further pleas. Just acceptance. It felt oddly satisfying. That evening, I sat alone, sipping coffee and contemplating everything. Lucas's visit had unsettled me, not because I felt guilty, but because I finally saw my family for what they truly were, people who only valued me as a backup plan. The weeks that followed were tense. Every time my phone buzzed, I expected another attempt to guilt-trip me. But nothing happened. The silence was eerie, and somehow it felt worse. Until one rainy afternoon when I got an unexpected visitor. I heard the familiar squeal of tires pulling into my driveway. Glancing out, I saw Lauren stepping out of her shiny SUV, walking toward me with her usual air of entitlement. Seriously, Elliot, she started before even saying hello. You're going to let your family struggle when you're sitting on a literal pile of gold? I didn't rise to her bait. I don't owe anyone anything. She scoffed. You're unbelievable. Mom and Dad raised you. Fed you. And now, when they need you most, you're pretending you don't even know them. I crossed my arms calmly. Funny. I don't remember you saying any of this when I needed help. Or when I was working multiple jobs to put myself through school because they wouldn't even fill out a financial aid form. She hesitated, momentarily silenced. I didn't see you standing up for me when Dad called my dreams a waste of time, or when Mom forgot my birthday 5 years straight, I continued, voice even. Funny how family only matters when you're on the losing side. Lauren clenched her jaw, clearly unprepared for me to stand my ground. Fine. Forget it. See if anyone cares about you once your 15 minutes of fame are up. She turned abruptly and stormed away, tires screeching as she sped off. I watched her leave, feeling more clarity than anger. I wasn't their ATM. I wasn't responsible for cleaning up their messes. If they wanted to pretend I didn't exist until they needed something, that was their mistake, not mine. A few nights later, I logged onto Facebook, a rare event, to see that my mom had made another dramatic post. Predictably, she painted herself as the victim, lamenting how her ungrateful child abandoned the family and refused to help despite newfound wealth. I almost responded. I nearly typed out another brutal truth to counteract her lies. Instead, I just closed the tab. For the first time, I didn't care what narrative they spun. They could tell whatever stories they wanted because I knew the truth, and that was enough. From that moment on, I decided something important. The best revenge wasn't proving them wrong or embarrassing them publicly. The best revenge was simply living well without them. And that's exactly what I planned to do. After Lauren's dramatic exit, things went oddly quiet again, but this time I didn't fool myself into thinking it was over. With my family, silence usually meant they were just regrouping, preparing their next move. In the meantime, I shifted my focus entirely onto my own life. My shop suddenly had a reputation boost. News of my unexpected discovery spread quickly, and customers poured in from everywhere. Suddenly, people who used to laugh at me now wanted to catch up, subtly fishing for details about the coins or casually mentioning how proud they were. But I stayed cautious, knowing too well how quickly people could turn when they smelled money. Every coin I sold, every dollar I made, I reinvested, fixing up my garage, buying tools I dreamed of owning for years, and turning my humble shop into a real, thriving business. Life was finally moving in a positive direction, and for a brief moment, I believed I might get to enjoy it without further interruptions. But of course, life never stays simple for long. One evening, just as I was closing up, my phone rang again. Another unknown number. Sighing, I answered cautiously. Hello? Elliot, it's Mom. Her voice was shaky, soft, a tone I hadn't heard since childhood. It caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting your call, I said carefully, not allowing myself to soften. I know. She hesitated, struggling with her words. I'm not calling to ask for anything. Not money, not help, nothing. I paused. This was new territory. Then why call? I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. For everything. Her words hung in the air, making my throat tighten unexpectedly. In all these years, I had imagined this moment so many times. I'd imagined anger, yelling, accusations, not quiet remorse. Why now? I asked cautiously. She sighed deeply. Your father and I have had a lot of time to think. When everything fell apart, we finally had to face our mistakes. Losing almost everything made us realize we lost you long before. I stayed silent, unsure how to respond. She continued, her voice breaking slightly. Elliot, we treated you horribly. We didn't appreciate you. We didn't support you. And I'm truly sorry for that. For a moment, old emotions stirred inside me, hurt, resentment, longing, but I quickly pushed them aside. I'd spent my whole life craving these words, yet hearing them now felt hollow. I appreciate you saying that, I finally managed. But it's too late. She paused again, this time with a sense of acceptance. I understand. We ended the call quietly, without drama, without anger. It wasn't the reconciliation she might have hoped for, but it felt oddly right. For once, she'd been sincere. For once, I believed her. And that somehow made things feel settled. I put down the phone, the quiet ringing in my ears louder than any shouting match could have been. But of course, peace with my family was never truly simple. A few days later, while I was working late, a familiar truck rolled into my driveway. Lucas stepped out looking exhausted, no smugness, no arrogance, just genuine exhaustion. I need to talk to you, he began quietly. I wiped the grease off my hands, wary. What's going on? He took a deep breath, eyes distant. Lauren's in trouble again. This time, it's serious. She borrowed money from some shady people. Dangerous people. I felt my stomach drop. How bad? He looked at the ground, unable to hold my gaze. Bad enough that Mom and Dad had to mortgage the house again to cover her debts. They didn't want to tell you. They're ashamed. But they're losing everything, Elliot. I stared at him, my heart pounding, torn between irritation and shock. Part of me wanted to dismiss him, to tell him it wasn't my problem. But another part knew I couldn't fully ignore this. I know you've helped her before, Lucas said, glancing at the garage behind me. And I know you're tired of it. But they don't deserve this. I sighed deeply, conflicted. I built all this from nothing, Lucas. And now I'm expected to risk it all because Lauren can't control herself. He nodded sadly. I know it's unfair. And I wouldn't blame you if you walked away. But they're desperate. And honestly, you're their last hope. I took a long, deep breath. I had finally built something of my own, earned the respect I'd always craved, and now my family's mistakes were threatening to drag me back down. But this time was different. For the first time, I had the power to decide their fate. And suddenly, a thought hit me, one that felt both satisfying and strangely comforting. I looked Lucas straight in the eyes. I'll help them, on one condition. He blinked, surprised. Anything. If I do this, I said calmly, it's not charity. I'm buying their house and they'll have to move out. I'll settle the debts, but from now on, they're on their own. Lucas was silent for a long moment. That's harsh. It's fair, I said firmly. They spent decades leaving me out, treating me like I was nothing. I'm not doing this because they deserve it. I'm doing it because it's the only way I'll ever fully move on. Finally, Lucas nodded slowly. I'll tell them. He left quietly, leaving me standing alone in the cool night air, uncertain yet strangely at peace. I'd finally made a choice that felt completely mine, not driven by guilt or a need for approval. This time, I wasn't fixing their mess. I was ending it. My brother left that night, and I sat alone for a long while, replaying everything in my head. I never imagined I'd be the one holding the power, the one deciding how things would go. But now that the tables had finally turned, I couldn't help but feel oddly calm. A few days later, Lucas called to confirm that my parents had agreed to my terms. They had no other choice, Lauren's reckless decisions had left them trapped. Pride was no longer an option. So I moved forward, arranging to meet them at a lawyer's office to finalize everything. The morning of the meeting was surreal. I dressed carefully, not to impress them, but to remind myself that I'd come this far on my terms. When I entered the office, my parents were already sitting at the large mahogany table, avoiding my gaze. My father looked older, shoulders hunched, eyes tired. My mom stared blankly at her lap, fiddling with a worn-out tissue. They barely resembled the confident, dismissive parents who'd made me feel worthless for so long. When the lawyer began explaining the details, my parents remained quiet, letting him do all the talking. The agreement was straightforward. I'd pay off their debts, and in return, ownership of their house would transfer to me. They'd stay there temporarily until they figured things out, but the home, the very symbol of the family they'd always chosen over me, would officially belong to me. My father finally looked up, his voice unsteady. Thank you, Elliot. I cut him off gently. Don't. I'm not doing this for your thanks. The lawyer slid the documents across the table. I signed quickly, not hesitating. When my mother tried to speak, I stood up, signaling I wasn't interested in hearing empty apologies or excuses. This wasn't about reconciliation, it was about closure. When the meeting ended, I shook the lawyer's hand and walked out first, leaving my parents sitting quietly at the table. Outside, the sun felt warmer, the air fresher, and for the first time in years, I felt free. But of course, my story couldn't just end there. Life always has another twist waiting just around the corner. Days later, as I was packing up after work, Lucas stopped by again, clearly uneasy. This time, he wasn't alone. Lauren was sitting in the passenger seat, looking more miserable than I'd ever seen her. My first thought was to turn away to avoid whatever drama they brought. But something stopped me. Lucas approached cautiously, Lauren trailing behind, looking humiliated. Lauren has something she needs to say, Lucas began firmly, giving her a nudge. She hesitated, avoiding my eyes, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. Finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry." I raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. For everything," she said softly. "The money, the debts, how I treated you all these years. I was selfish and I'm sorry." She looked genuine, almost heartbreakingly so. It was the first apology I'd ever gotten from her, from anyone in the family. It didn't erase the past, but for a second I felt something soften. Then, Lauren continued, her voice cracking slightly, "I'll pay you back someday. Somehow. I promise." I shook my head slowly. "Don't. Consider this my last gift to you. After today, we're done." She nodded quietly, understanding in her eyes. Lucas gave me a small, respectful nod, acknowledging the moment for what it was, finality. They walked back to their car, leaving me alone in my driveway, feeling oddly satisfied yet melancholy at the same time. I'd done what I needed to and said what I needed to say, and now it was truly over. That night I celebrated by myself. Not with champagne or parties, but with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I'd spent so much of my life chasing approval from people who never saw my worth, and now I had finally permitted myself to let go. A week later, as I stood inside my garage, polishing the Shelby to perfection, I heard familiar footsteps. It was Gary, my nosy neighbor, but this time he wasn't smirking. Instead, he wore a look I'd never seen before, genuine respect. "Guess I underestimated you," he admitted, eyeing the now-restored Mustang with clear admiration. "She turned out beautiful." I nodded, pride swelling in my chest. "Yeah, she did." Gary hesitated, glancing around awkwardly. "Listen, about how I acted before, I was wrong. You proved everyone wrong, especially your family." I gave a small shrug. "Appreciate it." Gary chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Guess you're the neighborhood celebrity now, huh?" I laughed lightly. "Something like that." Gary smiled and left quietly, leaving me to enjoy my victory alone. That night, sitting in my newly renovated garage, I realized something important. My whole life, I tried to prove myself worthy of people's attention, my family's, my neighbors', society's. I'd worked relentlessly, chasing something that always seemed just out of reach. But the truth was, I didn't need their approval anymore. I'd built something valuable, not just the garage, not just the Mustang, but a life that belonged solely to me. One I was proud of. One I didn't owe to anyone else. And that realization? That was worth more than all the gold coins combined. But what I didn't yet know was that my story wasn't done, not by a long shot. Just when I thought I'd left my family behind, another unexpected twist was waiting right around the corner. Just when I thought everything had settled, my phone rang late one evening, interrupting my quiet night alone in the garage. It was another unknown number, but by now that wasn't surprising. I picked up cautiously. "Hello? Elliot? It's Aunt Mary. Sorry for calling so late." Her voice was hesitant, cautious. I sat up straight, suddenly uneasy. Aunt Mary had always kept her distance from family drama. If she was reaching out, something big had happened. "What's going on?" I asked carefully. She sighed deeply. "I don't know if your parents mentioned it, but things got worse after your dad lost his job. They couldn't manage their debts, even after you stepped in to help." My stomach twisted. "How bad is it?" She hesitated again before answering. "The bank is foreclosing. They never told anyone how serious things had gotten. Now they're asking relatives to help, but everyone knows how they treated you. No one's willing to step up." I exhaled slowly, trying to process. On the one hand, it felt like poetic justice. But on the other, a tiny voice in my head wondered if I was partially responsible. "They asked me to talk to you," Mary continued quietly. "They were too ashamed to do it themselves. But Elliot, you don't owe them anything." "I know," I said quietly, more to myself than to her. "I'm not calling to ask you to help," she said gently. "I just thought you should know." After hanging up, I sat in the silence, staring at the Mustang parked in front of me, shiny, restored, and beautiful. A symbol of how far I'd come and everything I'd built on my own. Then, almost involuntarily, I thought about that house. The one where I'd grown up feeling invisible. The place where I was forgotten, ignored, made to feel small. The house was their kingdom, and I'd spent my childhood feeling unworthy of being part of it. And now I was the only person who could save it. The irony wasn't lost on me. The next morning I drove to the bank. I sat across from a manager, filled out paperwork, and settled everything in a matter of hours. I could see the surprise in his eyes, a guy in oil-stained jeans, casually paying off his parents' foreclosure debt without blinking. But that's exactly what I did. My parents didn't find out until later that day when I sent Lucas a simple text. "The debt is paid. The house is mine now. You have 2 weeks to move out." His response came fast and angry. "Are you serious? You can't kick out your own family." I replied calmly, firmly, they kicked me out emotionally years ago. Consider this repayment. No further messages came. I gave them exactly 2 weeks, which was rather fair considering everything. When the day arrived, I drove up to the house again, this time as the owner. Standing in front of my childhood home felt strangely surreal. My parents stood silently on the front porch, defeated, suitcases stacked beside them. My mom refused to look at me. My father's face was tight with barely controlled rage. Lucas and Lauren weren't even there to support them. It was just my parents, alone, stripped of their dignity, facing the consequences of their actions. I felt a complicated mix of victory, sadness, and relief. I hope you're happy now, my dad muttered bitterly. I looked him in the eyes, feeling calm and sure of myself. I am. But not because of this. They climbed into their car and drove away without another word. Standing alone on the front porch of my new property, the home I'd grown up feeling unwelcome in, I finally felt like the chapter was truly over. This wasn't revenge, it was justice. For once, they had experienced what it felt like to be powerless, overlooked, and abandoned. But unlike them, I didn't feel joy in their suffering. Instead, I felt free. As I walked back to my truck, ready to leave my childhood home behind forever, I realized something important. This house never represented family, not to me. Family wasn't defined by blood or property, by who shared your last name or who raised you. Family was about those who genuinely cared, supported, and respected you, people you chose and who chose you back. And as for me, I was finally surrounded by those people. My customers who had become friends, my neighbor Gary who had come around, and even my cousin Lisa and Aunt Mary who reached out when no one else did. Family wasn't something given to you, it was something you built yourself. As I drove away, leaving my past firmly in the rearview mirror, I knew exactly where I was headed next, back to the life I'd created. One where I wasn't forgotten. One where I was finally in control. And honestly, it felt amazing. Hope you enjoyed this story as much as I do. Help this small channel grow by hitting that like button, subscribing, and sharing with your friends. Every bit of support means the world. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.